Seven on Sundays podcast is intended for mature audiences. Episodes discuss sensitive and fraught topics that many teens and 20-somethings face, but may be triggering. The content may not be suitable for all audience members. Please take caution when listening.
One of the key things that he said to me was, "So you don't love me." And that was what really stuck with me, is I said, "I don't want to have sex." And he immediately felt like it was some form of punishment for him. I am a major people pleaser, and I felt so horrible that I just made my boyfriend mad. Like, it immediately all fell onto myself. I was the one to blame. I was like, I don't want him to be mad at me. I'll just initiate sex when we get home, so he will forgive me and he'll see that I still love him.
Hello and welcome to Seven on Sundays, the podcast about how young adults are navigating sex, relationships, and life today.
We are your hosts, Dr. Shez Leby and Stephanie Boy, and each week we will share our candid conversations with young adults and experts about today's tough topics. Today we are welcoming our guest B, who was in a 2-year relationship with a high school boyfriend. We have heard this similar situation before. She was in a 2-year relationship that was very emotionally abusive and manipulative and assaultive. So we are going to hear from her about her experience and how she kind of got to the other side.
Thank you so much for joining us, B. We are glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
I think what our audience would love to hear is your story and why you feel like it is such an important story to share for a larger platform, that it might help others who are going through or have gone through the same thing that you went through. So you can jump right in.
Yeah, so I wanted to share my story when you two came to my institution and handed out index cards and told us to write something that we would want to hear more about or talk more about. And my first thought was this high school relationship that I went through, because I remember coming out of it and feeling like I was the only person who had ever been through it. I felt so alone and so estranged. And so I want to share that in case anybody else has gone through something or is going through something like this, not alone. So,
Absolutely. If you want to just dive right in with the story.
yeah. So this guy, him and I went to school together in middle school, and freshman year we had classes together. And I started to have a little crush on him, and then at the end of freshman year, we connected and we started dating soon after. And about a few months in, maybe kind of over 6 months, pretty far into the relationship, is when we first had sex. It was my first time having sex. I was not his first partner. The first time was consensual. Nothing bad happened that first time, but later on, as sex became a more regular occurrence in the relationship, I started to kind of pull back a little bit because I still wanted to go on dates, and it felt like he only wanted to go over and have sex. So the first time that I remember this manipulation happening is we were parked behind the mall, and he wanted to have sex in my car. And I told him no, because we're in a public parking lot. It's broad daylight. I don't feel comfortable having sex. He started yelling. There was a lot of profanity. He even started crying. And one of the key things that he said to me was, "So you don't love me." And that was what really stuck with me, is I said, "I don't want to have sex." And he immediately felt like it was some form of punishment for him. And so I drove us home. We were silent. I was crying. And I am a major people pleaser. And I felt so horrible that I just made my boyfriend mad. Like, it immediately all fell onto myself. I was the one to blame. I was like, I don't want him to be mad at me. I'll just initiate sex when we get home, so he will forgive me and he'll see that I still love him. And so we had sex at my house that day. If the sex was mutually consensual, it was fine. But if I ever didn't want to have sex at a time where he did, again, he would get angry at me for saying no. And I would cry and I would feel bad for upsetting him. And then I would just have sex with him to mediate the situation to the best way that I could. And over time, it developed into this pattern of knowing that if I say no, I feel bad, he gets mad at me, so I just stopped saying no. And as this went on, I started to shut down. Emotionally, I was pulling back from the relationship because I constantly felt used and I felt gross and I was insecure. And I emotionally removed myself from the relationship because I just felt so gross around him. But at the time, I don't know if I really knew why. I don't know if I had really pinned it together that I felt uncomfortable around him because I was forcing myself out of my comfort zone and putting myself in a vulnerable position for him. But as I lost the ability to feel comfortable around him, the relationship began to fall apart. We had spoken about how I wanted things to go back to how they were before we started having sex in the relationship. I wanted to go back to the dates and the sweet talk and the cute stuff. And he just wanted everything to just fall back in place. He was very much a guy who would blow his fuse easily. He would yell, and it felt like I was walking on eggshells around him a lot of the times. And he had a major influence on me during our relationship in, like, a lot of areas. My social group was kind of formed around him. The way that I dressed, the makeup that I did, it was all influenced around him and, like, trying to make myself what he wanted so that he wouldn't get mad. Because there was this kind of fear that I had with him because I don't like being yelled at. Nobody likes being yelled at. And I knew that if I ever made him angry or did something that would upset him, he would yell. So in March of 2020, when school got shut down for COVID, is when I broke up with him. At this point, I had been unhappy in the relationship for a while, but I was still scared to break up with him because we went to school together and we had all the same friends, and I didn't want him to get mad at me in a public setting like school. So, in a very twisted way, I'm kind of grateful for COVID canceling school because I was able to break up with him and then I did not have to see him at school. So it was my first relationship, my first love, and it was built on a lot of verbal abuse and emotional manipulation. And a big part of that was sexual abuse.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, B. I can imagine how hard this is to have these conflicting feelings. You say that this was your first love and your first relationship, and I'm just wondering, when you look at this now and you understand it from from however many years later, did you say this was your freshman year in high school?
Yeah, we started dating freshman year and then we broke up in junior year.
So is this about 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, this was a while ago.
When you look back on it now, knowing what you understand about, because this is sexual coercion, emotional manipulation is sexual assault. That is a category in every state in the United States that is sexual assault. And I think from our conversation before, you do understand that that's what it was. Is that right?
Yeah, it took a long time, but I did work with it and I have come to terms with that label and I am comfortable saying that yes, this is sexual assault. What I went through was assault.
I'd love to hear you talk about how you came to understand that. Was it through therapy or whatever? But also how it shifts the way that you say, "This is my first boyfriend, yes. This is my first love." That's interesting to hear you say that even at this point. So could you kinda dive into that?
Yeah, so when we broke up, that started the kind of reflection process of wow, that was a lot to go through. And it took a long time. It took years for me to actually understand what had happened, understand that it was sexual assault, that I was being manipulated, because there was a lot of self-doubt, a lot of this imposter syndrome kind of thing, where it was a lot of self-doubt. I was invalidating my own feelings and experiences, and I was excusing his behavior because I wasn't able to really understand what had happened. So a lot of my thought process was like, "Oh, but it wasn't physical. He didn't hit me. So is it really assault if he didn't hit me? We were kids. Did he really even know what he was doing?" It was like it was not these, like, gory date rape, drug overpowering stories that you hear about, like, on the news. So was it really assault? And that's what my head was filling with. And I was in therapy at the time, and therapy has helped me out in so many different aspects of my life. And when I started talking about this relationship with my therapist, just the validation from somebody else was so helpful, and being able to talk about it, one, talking about it is hard because you have to acknowledge that it really happened, but it is really helpful, to really sit down, write it out, or talk about it.
My question was, and you started to get into it, but my question is, how did you end the relationship? Did you do it or did he initiate that?
Yeah, I was the one who initiated the breakup. Obviously, it was COVID, so we couldn't, like, hang out or see each other. So, I texted him, "Hey, I wanna talk," and then we called on the phone, and I was the one who called him and told him, "I'm not happy anymore. I wanna break up." And there was some of that manipulation in that phone call of him victimizing himself in this, of being like, "What did I do wrong? Oh, I'm so terrible, I'm awful, you hate me," kind of thing. Again, trying to get me to feel bad for him and take him back after I broke up with him.
Right. And did you do that? Did you take him back?
There were times where I would call him, and then later on the following year, like into senior year, there was one point where we did hook up again, just because I wanted to feel loved, you know? There was still a form of comfort in him. He was my first boyfriend, the first guy that I was ever romantic and sexual with, and so it was kind of my default of, I know that he'll provide a feeling of being loved, even if it's not real.
Right. That's
Can I
a biggie. Big, the weighing the cost of the sacrifice to your soul and yourself with, "Oh, but I can feel loved for a minute, even if it's not real."
Yeah.
That's a heavy, heavy one.
What's interesting is I think when we're talking about high school, when you say even if it felt like love and it wasn't, I think that's a really tricky thing. And I'm going to let Dr. Shez just reply to this too, because even though it's not love as we know what love should be, when you're that young, you don't know what love is supposed to look like, right? Like young people don't know what it's supposed to look like. This was really your first intimate sexual experience, so it can kind of really confuse our brains, right? So I think like love is a tough thing to expect in high school because people just at that age you don't know how to contextualize that or experience that. Like you know what you have with your family. It's like it's very experimental at that time. Is that true?
Yes. Well, from my perspective. What do you think?
I would also say yes, and that's also why I do still look at it as my first love, because I really do in that moment, obviously the sexual part of the relationship was not good, but there were romantic aspects. Like he was really funny and he was nice and he gave me compliments and stuff. So at that time, yes, I said I loved him, he said he loved me, and to me it felt genuine in that relationship.
Sure. And let me ask you, in other aspects of the relationship, like you just said, he was funny. Did he use an emotional manipulation in other aspects of the relationship, or was it really confined just to the sexual aspects of the relationship? Because I imagine that that's confusing if you have it only in one area because you go, this isn't really what this person is like, and I do love them, and they are all of these other things. So, was he emotionally manipulative in other ways?
No, it was just sex.
So that's confusing.
Yeah, that's
That's
why it
very
was so hard
confusing.
for me to understand really what happened. Because
Yes.
it's this guy that I loved and I spent like 2 years of my life with in high school, which is a long time for a high school relationship.
Yeah.
And but this whole other the behind the scenes of the relationship, the private life of the relationship was just awful.
So I think that that's something that we have to look at for high school relationships, all relationships. But I think that that's a really important point that in many other aspects of the relationship, he had a healthy way of being in that relationship. He gave you compliments. It seems like you felt supportive. But then in the sex, it was very different.
Was he emotionally manipulative outside of the sex, like with who you could be friends with or, what social gatherings you could go to or those kind of things?
It wasn't let me think. I've never thought about it as manipulation.
It sounds like it was more maybe he was guilting you into doing something that you said you didn't wanna do at different times and that he probably figured you wouldn't wanna do, but you're saying outside of the relationship, he was loving and kind and open and honest and not controlling?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was something that you said that was interesting to me because you said you were afraid to break up with him when you were at school because of what other people would say. Was that like his friend group would have given you a hard time for breaking up with him, or your friend group would have? What did you mean by that?
Well, our friend group in high school was merged. I kind of joined into his. Like, I would eat lunch with him and his friends, and I started to become friends with his friend group during that. So, if I had broken up with him during school, I didn't know who to go to, because, like, so much of my school life revolved around him. And so there was a lot of fear in we're going to break up. He's going to be mad at me. I don't have anybody to go to at school.
You did say that he would yell at you, right? What was that like?
It was the yelling of not wanting to have sex. It was the you don't love me. Why are you punishing me? What did I do wrong? Kind of things.
Okay. And did you get in therapy during this relationship or after?
I was in therapy before.
Okay. Okay. That's good.
Yeah.
But you did stay in it a long time, B. 2 years is a long time in the high school life. You're right.
Yeah.
And 2 years is a long time to struggle with that, you know, I don't know whether you want to call it like disconnect between what the relationship was outside of the sexual side of it and then what it was the sexual side of it. That can be for a young person, freshman, 14, 15 years old, that's a huge struggle. And to not feel as though you had someone who could give you advice or like understanding of how to deal with this. You were in therapy. Did you tell your therapist about this conflict?
Not about the sex or anything like that. I didn't tell my mom. I didn't want my mom to know that I was having sex. I didn't tell my therapist. I was worried that my therapist would tell my mom because I was
Mhm.
still a minor. I know there's confidentiality with therapy, but I was still a minor, so I didn't know if I would get in trouble if I told them. But my therapist knew about my boyfriend, and I told her all about the good things about my boyfriend. And there was some skepticism from my therapist. I don't remember what it was, but her I remember her making a face and asking me, "Is this a good relationship for you?"
How would you
So
answer that today? That's
I
a
would
great
say
question.
no. I
Yeah.
would say no.
What did you learn from that relationship?
Gosh, so much. I mean, I learned what I didn't like in a relationship. I learned that don't like being yelled at. I don't like being pressured into sex. But I also learned that I do like somebody funny and being complimented and spending time with another person that I loved. But I learned a lot about myself more after ending that relationship and learning, why did I let it happen? Why did I stop saying no? And then how that assault changed me and how it kind of stuck with me.
So what did you learn when you say, "Why did I let that happen?" What did you learn from that? Because,
Um,
the reason I'm asking that is not to have you go back and put the blame on yourself. I'm asking that because there's a young girl listening to this or a young man listening to this who's feeling pressured and is feeling the guilt of it on their shoulders. And I'm hoping that you can articulate how your mindset was then and what you have since learned that removed you from feeling as though this was something that you allowed to happen.
yeah, it happened because it was the best way that I knew how to make the conflict resolve. And that was it. I didn't have the resources that I have now to mediate a situation with a partner and actually explain this, that, and the next. I didn't have that. It was very impulsive. He's mad at me because we're not having sex. I'm going to have sex with him so that he won't be mad at me. And at that time, that was just what made sense. So I can't blame my younger self for that because she didn't know how to handle something that big in her 14-year-old, 15-year-old shoes, you know?
I
Absolutely.
I
Ab-
think and I'll provide this in the resources. There's some really great questions that I wish you had the relationship with one of your parents that you might have been able to say, I think I'm in this relationship. I'm thinking about having sex with this person. Your parents could have said to you, don't do that, whatever. Maybe that would have like given you more conflict. But there are a set of questions that you can ask a young person who is considering sex if they are ready. And I think that that sometimes helps us because, like I have said to kids, my own kids, whatever, who might say that they're in this type of relationship, one of the things I like to explain is that sometimes our bodies are ready for sex, right? Our bodies develop where we are horny or going through puberty, we're curious, all of those kind of things. But emotionally, we are not ready. And I think that is a really important point because a lot of young people feel as though they're ready to have sex because they feel mature, right? But we know that there's this lack of understanding how these relationships should go. We know that the emotional maturity is not there. And I think that's what is often forgotten by young people who make these decisions. And there are some questions you can ask yourself, or you can ask a young person to say, are you really ready for these types of situations? How would you handle this, that, or the other? Because physical readiness is much different from emotional readiness.
And B, I would add to that, the big question might be, what is your intention or motivation with any kind of intimacy? And that's really important to be really clear because your motivation was to stop a conflict, right? So
Mhm.
your body is then not even going to respond in a positive way where sex feels good, where it's because you're doing it to people please. You're doing it for another person or to stop a conflict. So those are the types of questions to ask ourselves and to ask, if parents can ask those, like, what is your intention? If you want to develop intimacy with somebody, what is the reason? And I'm sure there were times that you were interested in it or that was your motivation, but it sounds like a lot of the time was just to stop this conflict. I love that you recognize the people pleaser because how you are in the bedroom, if it was a bedroom or a car or wherever it was, how you are in the bedroom is how you are in life, right? I'm a firm believer of that as a therapist. So if you were a people pleaser in the quote unquote bedroom, it's great for me to hear that you recognize that you were, I hope you're recovering, a recovered people pleaser, but that you were a people pleaser. And so that's the place of change, is to start with, okay, how can I not be a people pleaser outside of these situations with a coercive, manipulative, I'll say, emotionally abusive kind of first boyfriend? How can I not be a people pleaser outside of the bedroom? And I'd love to hear your take on that, what you've done to kind of be a recovering people pleaser. A lot of women, girls, I'm here to say I'm part of that club, People Pleasers Anonymous. How are you, or how have you started to kind of recover from that tendency? And another caveat, really quick, when you said I wanted to feel loved, was where I definitely sensed some emotion. And I think looking there to the why of why feeling love from the outside was so important to you, and so important that you were willing to go back to somebody that was not giving you what you really wanted. So those are many questions, but let's start with the people pleasing maybe.
I will be completely honest and say that I am still a people pleaser, and I mean, I've been working on it in other aspects, but even in the sexual aspect, like, I still with my current boyfriend, I have defaulted back onto people pleasing in the bedroom with him.
Okay. So what's new and alive in you today about that topic? What are you going to look at or do differently based on our conversation today?
I think the importance of boundaries, recognizing where I've been without boundaries in that first relationship, what I went through, what I ended up with wasn't what I wanted. So I know that that's not what I want to repeat in my current or next or whatever relationship that I end up in. But I really think it's boundaries. I still have such a hard time with boundaries. I really do.
Do you know why?
It's either from that relationship or just my general people pleasing or whatever else in my childhood turned me into this people pleaser.
Can I ask you a question also? I feel like sometimes we fail to establish boundaries because we haven't written them out. I don't know whether you've actually taken time to think through them and write them out, but I think that's kind of sometimes the first step. And even just that, the power of writing something and knowing that it's your idea. This is what I don't want for myself. This is where I draw the line. Have you done that?
Not like physically written it out, no.
Sometimes things are required since you're speaking sexually. Sometimes things are requested of us sexually that we haven't even thought through. Like that's really important. If somebody suggests something and it's in the moment that you are sexually intimate, it's a little hard to make a decision in that moment. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So sometimes knowing what those things are, and Dr. Shez and I have a checklist of sexual activities, a lot of which are just normal, kind of things. And then there's also things on there that are inspired by people's porn habits and things like that, or cultural norms and things like that. But it's important to think about. And there are things on there that I, prior to having the list had or making the list, hadn't really thought about, like, how do I feel about someone seeing me naked in broad daylight, all of my bumps and bruises out for the world to see? There are all kinds of things that you can think through because as females, if your desire is to have a sexual relationship with him, it's just that maybe some of the things are crossing boundaries. Maybe you're okay with some things, but other things, as females, our bodies can't really be embodied and get fully aroused when we have things that cross our boundaries. It literally puts the brakes on our ability to achieve arousal, right? So that's really important to know where where are my boundaries, because my boundaries are going to cause me to put up brakes, and that's not going to be an enjoyable situation. So now you not only have emotional manipulation, but sometimes it's like a physically non-pleasurable act. And so then you get to the point of what is the value of this, right? Like, what am I doing? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's important. We can send you the list, but like to kind of think through, what do I want? Do I really want this? And be clear with your boundaries. Have you stated your boundaries and your current partner listens or doesn't listen, or you just haven't established them?
I don't think I've established them.
Yeah, that's important. You need to speak them. It gives them power too. Writing it, speaking it, reiterating it gives it power.
B,
Yeah.
what would be the opposite of people pleasing?
Like the complete opposite of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Narcissism.
Oh, okay. Forget that part. Forget
Oh,
that. Not that.
okay.
Something that is a positive. What's the opposite of people pleasing?
Mm,
I mean, it can be labeled narcissist, but what word would come before pleasing other than people?
self-pleasing.
Yeah, that's what Stephanie is talking about. I think that your magic elixir might be to frame everything and really get in the practice of this, of what is self-pleasing to me. And I'm not saying just sexual, I'm actually saying to start in other ways. You know, do I want a Coca-Cola or do I want orange juice? What is self-pleasing? Do I want to take a nap or do I want to go out with friends? You know, like really the opposite of self-pleasing is going within. And I think that wanting to feel loved from the outside is another way to look at loving yourself by self-pleasing. Then that need isn't so intense that you would go back to somebody just for the momentary, like, feeling of being loved because
Yeah.
you're loving yourself. So I'm just throwing that out there. That's therapy that I'm sure you would do with your therapist, but I think that that kind of lens we don't have when we're young. We're not exactly thinking that way, and I don't know what your, position in the family is, if you're middle child or what you are, but somehow you got really clearly ingrained to be this people pleaser. And I'm sure high expectations of yourself and all these other things that are really difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other thing I would just say to you and to anybody who's listening to this is like, and you might be able to answer it now, but it might be something you have to think about and journal about. What is your fear of expressing your boundaries? What is that? I mean, I guess it's that you're not people pleasing, but is there more to that? That like, because you have someone, I think it sounds to me like you are, emotionally intelligent. I don't imagine you're with somebody right now who's abusive. Maybe it's just a matter of not having expressed those, and you don't even maybe know how he'll respond to you putting up certain boundaries. He may be totally understanding of that. And I just, to put it in your head, because I think for a long time we had this metaphor of baseball when we're talking about sex. And there's a great TED talk by Al Vernaccio where he talks about a pizza metaphor. And I think it actually kind of works perfectly right here. And that is like before our idea was like, someone stole first, they got second, they had a grand slam. It's like all these things where one is the victor and one is the loser in the situation, right? Like you have the victor and you have the loser in a baseball metaphor. But he posits that perhaps we should change the metaphor to a pizza metaphor. That if, say, you and your boyfriend are going out to get pizza, you decide, and pizza obviously is your metaphor for sex, that when you go out to get pizza, you say to your boyfriend, "Oh, what do you want?" He says, "Oh, I really want like pineapple and pepperoni." And you're like, "Ugh, I hate pineapple. Let's just get pepperoni." So together you make a decision of what the two of you want together. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And you might even say sometimes, "Hey, I'm willing to try pineapple today." And that might be great, but just because you say you'll try pineapple doesn't mean you're gonna love pineapple and you're always gonna have pineapple when you go out to have pizza. It just means our, like, happy area is when we share a pepperoni pizza. Sometimes we might get crazy and throw some mushrooms in there, but maybe not, and we should probably talk about it before the girl brings us a pizza from the back with mushrooms on it, right? Like, it's a discussion that you're having. So if you can kind of use that, frame of mind to think about, this is a shared mutually enjoyable, definitely consensual, ongoing conversation that happens between you and your partner. It's not something where you have to be afraid of setting a boundary. It's a conversation. It's an exploration. Does that make it feel a little less intimidating?
Yeah.
I would add to that, I think before you can even make your order for pizza, and I love that metaphor and that he changed it because I'm all about changing metaphors. That one's such a good one. But before you can even communicate that, I feel like you have to go within and know how you are with certain things, and not just pizza, but the whole gamut of life, and really own yourself and baby steps to that, because people pleasers recovery, I'm here to say, it's not an easy, I'm going to go from being a massive people pleaser to now I'm going to exert my boundaries. I had a mentor tell me, if people are mad at you, that's a good thing. That means you're putting out boundaries. I was like, "Oh, I don't want anybody mad at me. That's not a good thing." But it's those baby steps in that direction where, you don't the goal is really not to have people mad at you, but it means that you are asserting your self-pleasure of what you want in life, not just sexually. I'm saying the gamut. But so I think really assessing that and getting to the place where you feel comfortable with your wants, needs, desires, you know, all those things.
And I think what you're saying, Shez, is that those baby steps are in everyday life situations because we know that we are most vulnerable in our relationships and in sex. So if you can establish those in regular everyday life, even if it's just your friends ask where to go to get dinner and you're like, "Oh, I don't know, where do you want to go?" Instead, speak your true desire.
Do you ever do that, B? Do you know what we're talking about?
Like, speak boundaries with friends?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think so, yeah.
good.
good.
So that's not an issue for you.
No.
It's really more in the sexual situations.
Yeah.
So maybe look at it more like a conversation, it's a discussion about what works for both of you. It's that pizza metaphor.
We're going to send you this checklist. What I like about the checklist is it's red, yellow, green. So it's not a yes, no. It's a yes, wholehearted yes. It's a no, wholehearted no. And it's a maybe. I'm willing to explore and talk about that before we do anything. But I think it's a really good self-assessment and a really good assessment together once you've done that. And it's a conversation starter. And people might think, because we've had this before where people think, oh, it ruins the mood. And that's just the opposite. When you start talking about your sexual desires or fantasies or interests, that actually elevates the mood and the arousal and the interest, because you're like, oh, I didn't know you'd be interested in that, or oh, I didn't know you want to explore that or talk about it. So I think it's a really good tool, but you have to be at a place in your relationship. I mean, I think it should happen any place in the relationship, but I do think that communication, is always open and honest and real. And if you can do this checklist, that says a lot about the relationship.
And can I also say one other thing? I don't know, your last relationship, you didn't want to have sex with that person. And I feel like I hear that a lot from girls this generation, that a lot of the sex they're having is for the other person, regardless of what is required in the sex. I also want to put out there that you also can draw those boundaries, that sex is not a foregone conclusion, and that it requires work on the part of the other person too, because it sounds to me like in your first relationship, and maybe even in this one, because we didn't really talk about this one as much, you needed those dates. You needed those, you know, affirmations that this person was there just watching movies, and that sex was not a requirement to get those things. But that was like what you needed foundationally to have a relationship that felt good to you. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Sex is not a requirement, like we spoke to a girl at a workshop who was like, I am not at a place in my life. Like my spirituality has become really important to me and I want to not have sex. Like we have great sex and it's really hard to not have sex, but I really don't want to have sex at this time in my life. I can only speak for like today and tomorrow and it's not something I want. You also can do that. And I think that that's important to understand. Just because we're sending you this list, it may not say sex or no sex on there, but you have to know you. You have to answer to you and be authentic and respect what your soul, what your body, what your mind, what your spirit is telling you. And if that is no sex, then that's also totally 100% perfect.
Definitely.
It's
Go ahead.
really interesting to me, B, that when I asked you the opposite of people pleasing, you went as far as narcissist. And that tells me a lot, actually, because there's a lot before narcissism. And that's what I think we're getting at here, that it just because you're owning your own boundaries and your own space and your own right does not mean that you are a narcissist. Like I want you to be really, hear that, because I think that's what happens sometimes, especially for women, that they'll self-sacrifice because, well, I'm not going to be that. I'm not going to be selfish. I'm not going to be a narcissist. But there's a lot of steps before you get to that. So I just wanted to comment on that too.
Yeah, I said the opposite of people pleasing being narcissism because in the high school relationship, when I talked about it with my current therapist, she pointed out the hints of narcissism in his self-victimizing kind of routine that he would do when he was upset. And she was the one to tell me like people pleasers and narcissists feed each other
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
worst way.
Totally. So not anymore, right? You're not doing that anymore?
Nope.
Yay.
I really want to go back and just address B, how you felt that this was imposter syndrome when you were experiencing what you experienced in your first relationship. And I just want to say there are going to be a lot of young people who hear this and go like, yeah, that's how I feel. I feel like this can't be rape. This can't be sexual assault because this person was a good and a nice person. And did I do something to put myself in that situation or did I and they're all the questions that a rape survivor asks themselves, whether it's in relationship or outside relationship. It's what did I wear? What did I say? What kind of ideas did I give? That that was an unhealthy, unwanted sexual experience that was forced upon you, whether by coercion or actual physical manipulation or physical violent, pressure to do it. So, Dr. Shez, what do you have to say about that? Because I'm sure you hear this a lot.
Yes. What I was wondering, B, is the imposter syndrome of I'm not worthy for my feelings because I wasn't dragged down an alley and drugged or whatever. So am I worthy to feel that this was assaultive behavior or it left that aftermath? Is that what you were talking about with the imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I'll add, so when I first talked about it, I went over the thought process and all of the thoughts that flooded my mind. It was physical, he didn't hit me, but he still hurt me. It
Yes.
wasn't physical, but he still hurt me, and I still have a right to feel hurt and feel upset. And then we were kids. Did he really know what he was doing? Whether he knew what he was doing or not doesn't change the pain that I felt.
Yes.
And then it wasn't gory, overpowering drug rape. Somebody else out there has had it worse than me and they need help. Somebody out there has not had it as bad as I had it and they still need help.
Yes.
Because
My
it's
gosh.
a spectrum. It's not an if X, Y, and Z, then it is assault.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for saying that. Thank you. You literally just helped so many young men and young women who have experienced this. Thank you.
Even though he was young, no means no. And we're taught that, if your mother says don't touch the stove, no, you don't touch the stove. Like we understand no matter what age we are that no is no and I have right to say no. You have a right to say no. Everyone has a right to say no. So we don't have to justify that he was young, That's not he knew no, but he wanted what he wanted. And the key for young women is, okay, I said no. I gave him every indication this is not okay. What do I do next? What do I do to get myself out of this situation? That's where I think that the disconnect is, because what happened in your mind maybe was, well, if I just do this, it's not that bad. It's okay. Then I'll just do it and he won't be mad. Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what would you do differently at this age and stage of your beautiful life?
I say no. Like with my current boyfriend, if I do not want to have sex, I say no. And if he gets upset, that's on him. That's not on me.
Great. Amen.
Yes. And I also want to say to Dr. Shez, as we know no from the time we're young, we also understand that touching bodies is different than taking a French fry off of someone's plate. There's a big difference when I'm saying no about you touching my body than I'm saying no, like, hey, don't take my French fries. Like you might be like, ha ha ha, I'm joking around but there's a big difference, and we all know that. Every human being knows that there is a difference. It's not unclear that that is a very different situation than taking French fries off of the plate, or, maybe borrowing someone's dress or clothing, that they're not really happy about you. Like there's a big difference. This is someone's physical, sexual boundaries. And if parents aren't making that clear, that should be made clear to every child from a very young age, including like the one who may be sexually assaulted, because that's where we don't know. Where does our body end and begin? And that's a lot of times why I say to parents, it's important from a very young age that we allow our children to have agency over what they put on their body, how their body is touched, who they hug, who they have to kiss, what they want to do. Do they want to go to a friend's house? We should be, reiterating that at every stage, so that you're not going, well, I don't know. Did I blah, blah. No, you said no. And there is a difference touching somebody versus taking a French fry.
The other thing in just relationship skills, kind of 101 stuff, is with your current boyfriend, when he shows you the respect that you say no and he says, okay, or he lets it go, I would communicate about that. I would sit down outside of that whole situation and say, I wasn't feeling it and I communicated it. And I want to tell you, in the past, that wasn't respected, but you respected that. And that means a lot to me. And it says a lot about our relationship, says a lot about you. I think it's really important to continue to open up what's working in your relationship and kind of, discuss that and continue that. When you bring it up as in that way, more of that happens, because they're like, oh, ding, 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 I did something right. And he can do the same thing with you. But I don't feel like we do that enough in relationships. We don't talk about what's working sometimes. We don't talk about what's not working either, but until it's a big problem. But we don't talk about what's working. So that's a great thing to let him know how appreciative you are of that. It's a give it like it should happen. So it's not like it's a big feat, but just letting him know that in the past that didn't happen and you're appreciative.
Yeah. Can I also add one more onto the kind of tackling the imposter syndrome and understanding what had happened?
Please.
There was also a big hurdle to get over of having to label him as an abuser, because we had talked about how I still consider him to be my first love, because it was a long relationship. I hit all of my milestones, like the first kiss, the holding hands, the first sex. Those milestones are all shared with him. And I have very fond memories of him. And it was really hard to say that he did abuse me, because that's a part of validating that experience that I went through. But it was really hard for me to come to terms with that, because it feels like such a big, scary word. But in reality, I haven't talked to him in 4 years. And even though now I know that he is an abuser, I haven't seen him. His life hasn't changed.
Yeah. Part of conceptualizing our past is remembering the good and the bad and the ugly and the pretty and the like we are multidimensional. So it's okay that it was, it was hard and you learned a lot, which is beautiful. But it's okay that it's not a rosy picture and you can have those memories. You can still have fond memories of him. And you can also remember that, yeah, there were some pretty terrible points, but boy, did I learn from that. So no one is unidimensional. We're many parts and pieces. And that's okay. That's a part of the human experience. We're all growing and learning. So I love that you pointed that out. Labels, I really don't like labels. I stopped diagnosing people because I don't have to anymore. It helps in some cases, but I don't like labeling. I agree with you. So you can say that he is a person that you learned a lot from, that yes, he did, assaultive behaviors that were not good, not anything you wanted. And there were some good memories, and that's okay.
I also want to add on to I learned from this relationship because a lot of the self-doubt that I had was it lasted 2 years. Why did I stay in that relationship for so long if I knew that I wasn't happy like a year into it? Why did I stay in it? And I think it was like an Instagram infographic or something, but it really stuck out to me. And it was like the time that you spend with somebody is how much time it takes for you to learn. So I needed to be in that relationship for those 2 years to learn everything that I needed to out of that relationship because it completely changed me as a person, you know? And so instead of going back and hating my younger self for being like, "Why didn't you leave when you could have?" I learned so much in those 2 years with him, and my life would be completely different if I didn't have those life lessons.
What a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful reframe. That's really good. That's really good. I love that you have that perspective because nothing is ever wasted. So there's no wasted time. And you left when you were ready to leave.
Yeah.
That is very powerful. I'm glad you saw that. I'm glad you shared that with us because that's a great way for us to see it too. Instead of looking at like those 2 years as a waste, you really and actually that's what I've always gotten from you is this inner strength that like everything is for your better good. So even though it was, not all and some very negative experiences, you learned from it. And I think that just shows that you are such a warrior.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for joining us, B. I hope that you embrace your warrior spirit of self-pleasing. I hope that becomes something that you feel really strong in. You're there. I mean, I can tell you're there, but I hope you feel more and more empowered in that. And thank you for sharing this because I know this will help a lot of young women in the same situation where they don't understand why they would stay in something that is not, healthy.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't have anything more.
Well, we are so grateful for your time and your story, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Of course, our pleasure.
Thank you, B.
Okay.
Go self-please.
I will.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Yay. Bye. That was another great podcast. I'm really grateful that B was with us to share her story. I think several things came up for me. One is, Steph, when you spoke about the questions to ask, again, as we said in the interview, it's really important to know your intention for why you are engaging in an intimate relationship. What is your why? And if the why has anything to do with people pleasing, as B shared with us, that's not a good enough why. That is the worst kind of why to have. So I think, her insight about her people pleasing was really, really good and deep and important. I don't want her to keep saying that mantra that I'm just a people pleaser. It's just what I am. There are roots to that we can look at that are really important that she can look at in therapy. A lot of times the roots are fear of abandonment, all kinds of insecure attachment theory. All those things are what you want to look at with people pleasing. What I love about her shift is that we're helping her shift into this higher place of elevated self esteem, self knowing, self regulation, independence, and the magic word self pleasing. We really want her and any young person out there or adult to look at in any of these kind of experiences, are they manipulating me because of codependence? And where is my self pleasing? And that's the task at hand. So I'm really happy that we were able to bring these things to light because they're very important.
You know what, Shez, I love that you talked about the questions to know her readiness, or for any person, young person who's thinking about becoming sexually active, to know their readiness. And B is not alone in making choices that reflect the needs of others rather than herself, because I honestly think this is one of the most common scenarios that I've heard from young people. And I know in the podcast, I said 1 in 16 people say their first sexual experience was coerced. But there is another study, which is equally interesting, that talks about, that 1 in 10 high school and college age people have admitted to forcing someone into sexual activity against their will. So, the research, says that this spike in coercive behavior starts around 16 for young men, and girls start to be more coercive in trying to get what they want sexually around the age of 18. So it can't be overstated. These experiences lay the foundation for future relationships. Like you said, B herself acknowledges she's still working on her people pleasing. I think you made a great point to not keep naming yourself, because that has power over your behavior or the thought process that you have about yourself. So I love that we have to give her a new mantra in her own mind. But I want to talk about something that I think is a little bit unclear for a lot of people, because it's not something we use in our everyday vernacular, and that is agency. And I'm specifically talking about sexual agency, which is, in my definition, the ability to identify and communicate your sexual needs and boundaries. So, agentic people are empowered to freely choose what they want and control the circumstances around those sexual encounters. Like B talking about not wanting to have sex behind the abandoned mall, but then feels the obligation to satisfy her boyfriend at home. That is not agentic, right? Because as you said, Dr. Shez, she's doing this because of somebody else's emotional outburst. It's not something that is truly coming from an organic place inside of her. And this is valuable because we as parents need to instill this in our children. We need to empower them from the earliest ages to honor their voice and their choices, teach them agency early, and lay the foundation for healthy, intimate encounters down the road. We're not obviously showing them how to behave explicitly in intimate encounters when they're young, but we're actually laying the foundation that they trust what they want for themselves, and we're empowering them to make those choices. So I think that's a really important lesson for parents that can start with very young children. And lastly, I just think it's really important what B shared about feeling as though she had imposter syndrome as it related to her continued coercive sexual assault at the hands of her, admittedly her boyfriend, but she had to come to terms with being able to call her assaulter. That's a very hard switch. I know you could probably talk about that better than I could, but I loved how she shared that she struggled with the dichotomy of, this person being nice and fun and then throwing a tantrum to have sex. Because no matter what sexual assault looks like, it still creates negative reactions, responses in our bodies. So whether he was kind and all of those kind of things, and it was hard to acknowledge that that's who he was. It doesn't matter if you're pulled down the street, by some random stranger, or it's at the hands of somebody who you love. You are not an imposter. That is still assault, and it still has the same fallout.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. Here's what comes up for me with that, and this is so fascinating almost. And B, my gosh, I love you. So even though you know it was sexual assault, your people pleasing capacity still has struggles with recognizing your places where you were hurt. Even though it was obvious that you were hurt, you're even willing to go that step of, well, it wasn't as bad as being drugged down the alley. So this people pleasing thing, and I know many, many women that have it, it is pervasive, and it is like a toxic little disease that negates who we are at our soul level, or our soul needs, or our personal needs. So I want us to really use this interview to catch those things and to help each other with that, call each other accountable and be like, no, that is so not imposter. Yes, you were assaulted. Yes, you deserve all that comes with that. So thank you for bringing that up, because that is where this people pleasing thing keeps eking. So we're going to stop that.
Just in closing, I think it's very appropriate that she chose the pseudonym of B, because I'm going to give you a new mantra. B is for brave. You are brave and you've got this, and you have done an amazing job coming as far as you have and sharing this story. So thank you so much for your story. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to our wrap up. And we hope to have you as our listeners next week as well. Take care.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of 7 on Sundays.
The 7 on Sundays podcast represents the opinions of Dr. Shez Levy and Stephanie Boy based on our experience. It also shares the stories, behaviors, and opinions of our guests that we do not necessarily condone or view as healthy. 7 on Sundays is an open forum to discuss what is happening with our listening audience. Some names and details of our guest stories have been changed to protect their anonymity. This podcast is not a substitute for mental health treatment. If you are in crisis and in need of mental health support, please call 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It is free and confidential.
Join the conversation and connect with us through our website, 7onsundays.com. That's the number 7 onsundays.com. We encourage everyone to do their own research. Thank you and be well.